So here's the thing about Steven Universe. If you only ever caught it in passing a few minutes on a Saturday morning, maybe your younger sibling watching it in the next room, it looks almost aggressively cheerful. The colors are pastels. The main character is a round, soft kid in a star shirt who loves ice cream sandwiches. There's a magic lion. There's a beach town full of people who are all, almost without exception, quite nice to each other. The theme song is about having time to be happy. It takes about 45 seconds to feel like you've wandered into the safest possible corner of the animated universe. And then you actually watch it. And I mean watch it. Not just have it on in the background while you do something else. You pay attention. You notice the details. You start catching things that the show slips in without underlining them. Without making a fuss, without a dramatic musical sting to tell you that what just happened was actually quite a lot to process. That's what I want to talk about tonight. Not in a horror documentary way. This isn't one of those videos. Steven Universe isn't a dark show in the way that something like, I don't know, a late night adult animated series is dark. It's dark in a much quieter and, if anything, more persistent way. The kind of dark that accumulates in the background while you're watching Steven learn to use his shield. The kind that you only fully notice when you come back to an episode you've seen 3 times before, and a line lands completely differently because now you know what it means. That's the particular experience I find really hard to shake with this show. And I suspect a lot of people who grew up with it feel the same way. You rewatch something from the early seasons, something that seemed like a one-off, a bit of world building, maybe a throwaway joke, and suddenly it's connected to 5 other things, and the shape of it changes entirely. The darkness isn't hidden exactly. The show is quite honest about it, in its way. It just trusts you to notice. The thing that makes this work, I think, is that the show never uses its darkness as a trick. It doesn't deploy a sad reveal and then immediately pivot to comedy to make you feel better. It lets the sad thing be sad, moves the story forward, and trusts that you can hold both the comedy and the weight simultaneously. Which you can. Which is actually how most of life works, when you pay attention. So tonight we're going to sit with that. We're going to go through the lore at a gentle pace, section by section, and I'll share the things that keep coming back to me every time I think about this show. Some of it is genuinely quite sad. Some of it is the kind of thing you file away, and it surfaces unexpectedly at 2 in the morning when you're not doing anything in particular. Some of it is just fascinating in the way that really thorough world building tends to be fascinating, once you understand how the pieces fit. If you're here to fall asleep, brilliant. This is a good one for that. There's no countdown to anything, no big revelation waiting at the end that you need to stay awake for. Each section is its own thing. You can drift off during the cluster and wake up during Spinel, and that's absolutely fine. Nothing will be ruined. If you're here because you love this show and you want to spend some time with someone who also loves it, also brilliant. Pull up a blanket. Get comfortable. A quick thing before we start. If you're enjoying this and you'd like to see more videos like it, subscribing does genuinely help. It takes about 2 seconds and then you can forget about it and go back to just existing comfortably in the dark. One thing worth establishing before we go any further. I'm not going to be talking about Steven Universe the way you'd talk about a show that's primarily a mystery box. There are reveals in this show, significant ones that genuinely reframe everything you thought you understood. But that's not really the point. The point is what the show is doing with those reveals. The point is the texture of the world and the people in it, and the things the show chooses to show you quietly rather than announce. I also want to say, for anyone who hasn't seen it, or who is only partway through, nothing I cover tonight will ruin the experience of watching it. If anything, knowing what the lore eventually amounts to makes the early seasons even more interesting to rewatch. Because you can see the show already laying foundations for things that won't become clear for another 3 seasons. It's a show that trusts its own architecture. That's rarer than you'd think, right? Let's start at the very beginning, which is appropriately quite a lot more sinister than the show initially lets on. Before Steven, before the Crystal Gems, before Beach City, There was the Gem Empire, and the Gem Empire was built on a process that, when you think about it for more than 30 seconds, is one of the more quietly horrifying premises in any animated children's show I can think of. We'll get into that now. Gems are, at their core, a resource extraction civilization. That's the foundational thing. And the show tells you this relatively early, but it takes a while for the full weight of it to settle. Here's how it works. When the Gem Empire identifies a planet suitable for colonization, they send in injectors, enormous mechanical drilling machines, to implant embryonic gems into the planet's crust. The planet's minerals, its organic compounds, its geological energy, all of it gets drawn up through the injectors over hundreds or thousands of years, and eventually new gems emerge from the ground, fully formed, ready to serve whatever function their gem type dictates. The planet in the meantime is destroyed. The life on it dies. The surface is stripped and cratered. Whatever was there before the injectors arrived simply doesn't exist anymore. Earth was next. That was the plan. The whole show essentially begins because Earth was on a list somewhere in Homeworld's records, a colony in progress, an investment that hadn't yet paid off. There were already kindergartens here. You can visit them in the show. Amethyst came out of one. There are still holes in the rock where other gems emerged, like the impression left by something that used to be there and isn't anymore. What I find interesting about this, and slightly unsettling, is that the show doesn't frame the Gem Empire as cartoonishly evil about any of this. Yellow Diamond and Blue Diamond aren't twisting their metaphorical mustaches over the destruction of organic life. They genuinely don't think of it as destruction, not in any morally meaningful sense. Planets are resources. Organic life is incidental. The idea that a world teeming with biodiversity and billions of years of evolutionary history might have intrinsic value that outweighs its mineral content simply isn't part of the framework they were raised in. That's a particular kind of scary when you think about it. Malice is, in a strange way, easier to process. You can point to it. You can say, there it is. There's the bad thing. But a civilization that causes incomprehensible harm as a perfectly routine administrative matter without anyone involved feeling particularly guilty about it, because the harm just isn't on their moral radar. That's something else entirely. There's a related detail in how the gem caste system works that's worth noting here, because it feeds into everything else. Every gem type has a function and a rank. Diamonds are rulers. Pearls are servants. Rubies are soldiers. Quartzes are warriors and guards. Peridots are technicians. And each of these types is made in a specific way. The conditions of the kindergarten, the quality of the minerals, the length of time given to incubation. And those conditions determine not just what type of gem you'll be, but how strong, how capable, how suited to your designated role. You don't choose your function. You emerge already shaped for it. This is the detail that makes the rebellion, when you understand it fully, genuinely radical rather than just politically convenient. The crystal gems weren't just refusing to colonize a planet. They were refusing the foundational premise of gem society that what you're made for is what you are, that your type determines your worth, that the hierarchy is natural rather than constructed. Garnet alone, as a fusion of two different gem C types who chose each other, was a walking refutation of everything Homeworld considered self-evident. It also makes the gems who stayed on Earth, Amethyst most obviously, but the corrupted gems too, before the corrupting light, interesting in a specific way. They're gems made for Homeworld's purposes who ended up becoming something else. Amethyst came out of the kindergarten 500 years after the war ended, long after everyone had left, with no diamond, no assignment, no context for what she was supposed to be. The crystal gems found her and took her in, and she grew up on Earth and became entirely herself. No function assigned, no hierarchy to slot into, just a person, finding out what that meant. Now, the Gem Empire has been running for a very long time. The show doesn't give us exact numbers, Gem history has a sort of deep time quality where specific dates are rare, and you're mostly working with thousands of years and eons, and the occasional reference to an event that places something in a general era. But the colonization of Earth was already well underway before the events of the rebellion, which was roughly 6,000 years ago, and the Empire had been colonizing planets long before that. There's a detail about the eras that I find genuinely sad, in a way that snuck up on me. Era 1 is what Gem Society was like before the war. Before Pink Diamond's alleged death and the corrupting light, and the loss of an entire colony. Era 2 is what came after. And Era 2 gems in general are smaller and weaker than Era 1 gems, because the kindergartens don't have the same resources anymore. The war depleted things. The loss of Earth's colony, which would have generated an enormous number of new gems, left a gap that Homeworld never fully recovered from. Peridot, our Peridot, the one who shows up on Earth as a somewhat antagonistic presence and eventually becomes one of the most beloved characters in the show, is an Era 2 gem. Her limb enhancers, the mechanical attachments she wears on her hands and feet, aren't aesthetic choices or weapons upgrades. They're compensating for what she didn't get at birth. She was made during a resource-poor period, and her natural form reflects that. Without her enhancers, her hands are tiny. She can barely reach anything. She's spent her whole existence propped up by technology to make herself functional in a role she was created for. There's something a bit heartbreaking about that when you see it clearly. The whole system degraded itself. The Empire's hunger consumed the resources that would have sustained future generations, and the gems who came later, the Peridots, the smaller rubies, the less powerful versions of every type, are living in the shadow of that. They didn't make the choices that led to the shortfall. They were just born into it. Anyway, the kindergartens, on Earth specifically, were set up in what the show calls the Prime Kindergarten, in Facet 5, and later in the Beta Kindergarten, which was added during the war as an emergency measure when Homeworld needed more soldiers quickly. The Beta Kindergarten was rushed. The gems that came out of it were inconsistent. Some emerged poorly, some were stronger than expected. Almost all were flawed in some way. Jasper, who we'll get to eventually, was one of the Beta Kindergarten gems. She's described as the only successful one from that batch, which is a framing that tells you quite a lot about how Homeworld thinks of its own people. And there's something almost planetary about the kindergartens as physical spaces. The show's art direction makes them look ancient and significant, like geological formations, like something the Earth remembers even if the humans living nearby don't know why. The rocks look that way. The holes where gems emerged are still there. They'll probably always be there. Earth carries the marks of what almost happened to it. There's a moment in the show where Steven and Amethyst visit the Prime Kindergarten together, and Amethyst looks at the holes in the rock, the impressions left by gems that emerged before her, the hole she herself emerged from 500 years after the war, and there's something in her expression that's genuinely difficult to name. She came from this place. This place was built to harvest a planet she loves. Those two facts don't resolve into something clean. She just carries them both. That's the kindergartens, in miniature. The show doesn't tell you how to feel about them. It just builds them with enough detail that you end up feeling quite a lot, without quite being sure where to put it. What prevented the colonization, ultimately, was one diamond deciding that the life on this particular planet was worth more than a new batch of gems. Which brings us to her. Pink Diamond is the central mystery of Steven Universe. Not in a thriller puzzle way, more in the way that a person you've never met can be central to a story because every other character is still, in some sense, living in the aftermath of who she was and what she did. She was the youngest of the 4 diamonds and the smallest, which in Gem Society carries a weight that's hard to fully articulate. The diamonds aren't just rulers, they're something closer to gods, or at least that's how they function in Gem consciousness. Their size reflects their authority. Their color dictates their domain. The hierarchy's total, and as far as most gems are concerned, self-evident and more not an arrangement that could be otherwise, but simply the shape of the world. Pink, at the bottom of that hierarchy, was given Earth as her first colony once she'd spent enough time lobbying the others for the responsibility. She was excited about it. Genuinely, earnestly excited. The show gives us glimpses of early Pink Diamond, and she has an enthusiasm that's almost uncomfortable to watch in retrospect, because you know where it goes. She threw herself into the preparations. She was ready to become the kind of diamond her sisters expected her to be. And then she got to Earth and couldn't do it. What happened, as best as we can piece it together, is that Pink arrived and actually looked at the planet, looked at the life on it. And something in her that the Empire had never cultivated and didn't especially want cultivated. Empathy, I suppose, or at least something that functioned like it, simply wouldn't let her proceed. She didn't want to destroy it. She wanted to protect it. She asked Yellow and Blue to let her stop. They said no. She asked again, making different arguments. Yellow's response was essentially, "You started this, finish it." Blue's response was more complicated. Blue created the Zoo, a facility on a pink diamond-controlled space station, designed to house humans safely away from the colonization. A compromise, meant to show Pink that preservation was possible alongside colonization. "Here," Blue said effectively, "I've saved some of them for you. Now carry on." Pink did not find this satisfying. I don't know why anyone thought she would, honestly. What followed was years of escalating desperation. Pink started a rebellion, initially as a performance, a way of creating enough disruption to give Yellow and Blue an excuse to call the whole thing off. She created a persona, Rose Quartz, a crystal gem fighter who led the other rebels. She thought if the colony looked sufficiently unstable, sufficiently costly to maintain, the other diamonds would agree it wasn't worth it and let her have the planet. The rebellion didn't stay performative. She started to care about the crystal gems she had assembled. They cared about each other and about the life on Earth in ways that changed her. By the time things had properly escalated into a war, she wasn't pretending anymore. She genuinely didn't want Homeworld to win. This is where the story gets complicated in a way the show is quite careful about not smoothing over. The rebellion, as it grew and evolved, wasn't run with full transparency. Rose, who remembered that she was Pink Diamond, who knew things about Homeworld and its capabilities and its weaknesses that she'd grown up with as a diamond, made choices about what to share and what not to share with her crystal gems. She kept her own identity secret, which is understandable. But she also kept other things secret. What happened to Bismuth? What Homeworld was capable of? The full shape of the choice she'd made when she staged her death. The crystal gems who fought in the war believed they were fighting for something they understood. They weren't, entirely. They were fighting for a cause that was real and meaningful, but their commander was carrying information that changed the picture in ways she never told them about. That's one of the harder things about Rose Quartz as a character. The love was real, the commitment to Earth was real, the care for her crystal gems was real, and she still kept secrets that cost people enormously repeatedly, and mostly went unexamined because she was gone before anyone could confront her about them. Here's where the abuse dimension comes in, and I think this is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. When Pink was difficult, when she pushed back, when she made scenes, when she refused to comply, she was put in a tower, locked away until she calmed down. Blue would come and visit her eventually, and the visit would consist of Blue reducing Pink to tears, and then Blue comforting her in her grief. That cycle, punishment, then tearful reconciliation, then back to compliance, isn't a loving relationship. It's dressed up as care, but it's control. The show doesn't editorialize this heavily. It just shows it to you in a flashback, in a fairly quiet episode, and lets you process it yourself. Yellow's approach was simpler. Dismiss everything Pink felt as immaturity. Pink's concerns about Earth, about the life on it, about the cost of what they were doing, all of it was waved away as the emotional excess of the youngest diamond, someone who'd grow out of it eventually if she was managed correctly. Neither yellow nor blue was cruel in the way of someone who enjoys causing harm. They genuinely didn't think of what they were doing as harmful. Which, again, doesn't make it better. Eventually, Pink ran out of legitimate options. The war was being lost. Homeworld was sending more soldiers, escalating pressure. And Pink made a decision that I suspect she thought was clever, and that turned out to be one of the most consequential mistakes in the show's history. She staged her own death. The mechanics of it are actually somewhat elegant in their desperation. She compressed some dirt into fake gem shards and swallowed them. She instructed Pearl, the gem who served her, to shapeshift into the form of Rose Quartz and poof her in public. Leave the fake shards on the ground. Let everyone who witnessed it believe that Rose Quartz had shattered a diamond. Then Pink would reform quietly and live out her existence on Earth as Rose forever. The plan had obvious holes. The defense Zircon at Steven's trial later points this out with the quiet satisfaction of someone who is very good at their job. How exactly did Rose Quartz penetrate Pink Diamond's entire retinue of guards, agates, sapphires, and personal soldiers to reach her? It doesn't make sense if you think about it for more than a moment. The whole thing is a bit of a mess, honestly. It was a plan made by someone who was frightened and exhausted and hadn't slept properly in what might have been centuries. What's interesting about the defense Zircon's argument, and the show is careful to let this land before it gets swept aside, is that she's functionally correct. The shattering, as officially recorded, couldn't have happened the way it was said to have happened. Someone with access, with Pink's trust, with the authority to be close to her without raising alarm, must have been involved. The defense Zircon nearly names Pearl, or at least nearly names someone in Pink Diamond's personal entourage, and for this she gets poofed by Blue Diamond. Because sometimes the truth is inconvenient, and the people in authority have the means to make it go away. Steven watches this happen. He's sitting in the middle of his own trial for something his mother did, watching a gem get silenced for being right, and he's starting to understand the shape of the world he's inherited. What Pink did not anticipate, couldn't have anticipated, I think, was how the other diamonds would react to her death. She thought they didn't care about her enough to cause a catastrophe. She was wrong. They cared enormously in whatever ways diamonds care about things, and the grief of 3 diamond-level beings screaming their anguish into the sky is not a small thing. It corrupted every gem left on Earth who wasn't shielded by Rose's bubble or already underground. Thousands of beings turned into monsters, trapped in damaged forms, for thousands of years. Pink, now living as Rose, was responsible for that. Not intentionally, not because she wanted it. But the escape route she chose kicked a door open that couldn't be closed again. There's a version of Pink Diamond's story that's easy to read as heroic. The youngest diamond who saw clearly when the others couldn't, who gave up her status and her identity to protect something she loved. And that version isn't wrong. But it's not the whole picture. We'll be adding to it all night. Let's talk about the corrupting light, because I think it gets summarized as a weapon the diamonds used and then sort of moved past, when actually the specifics of it are much stranger and sadder than that framing suggests. It wasn't designed. That's the first thing. The diamonds didn't sit down and engineer a weapon of mass psychological destruction and deploy it strategically. What happened was that yellow, blue, and white, 3 beings of incomprehensible power who had just been told that their youngest sister was dead, screamed, out of grief. The combined frequencies of 3 diamond auras hit every gem on Earth who wasn't somehow protected. There's something almost worse about that than if it had been intentional. A deliberate weapon implies thought, planning, a degree of remove. This was raw emotion, enormous and uncontrolled. And it happened to be apocalyptically destructive because of the scale of what the diamonds are. They weren't trying to punish the crystal gems. They were just devastated. And the devastation passed through them like a shockwave. Corruption, as a condition, is somewhat difficult to explain. partly because the show is deliberately a little elliptical about the mechanics of it. What we know is this: a corrupted gem can no longer maintain a stable physical form. Their sense of self, whatever it is that allows a gem to project a coherent, humanoid body, is fundamentally disrupted. They become animalistic. They behave more like creatures than people, driven by instinct and, in many cases, what appears to be distress. Here's the detail that I keep coming back to: the corruption doesn't shatter them. It doesn't crack their gemstones. If you look at a corrupted gem, their physical gemstone appears undamaged. The harm is entirely psychological. Something in the gem's mind, in whatever serves as a gem's sense of identity and self, has been scrambled beyond the point of recovery by normal means. These were people. That's the thing the show insists on, quietly and persistently, even when it's technically showing you a centipede monster or a giant bird creature attacking a building. These were soldiers, navigators, pilots, geologists, workers of all kinds who happened to be on the wrong planet when three beings who loved their sister very much started screaming in unison. They didn't do anything particularly wrong, they were just there. Centipedal, the corrupted gem who appears early in the show as a recurring monster that the crystal gems fight, is a good example of what this actually looks like in practice. She spits acid. She's territorial and aggressive, and she makes sounds that aren't words. The crystal gems fight her several times before they bubble her and put her in storage. And then there's an episode where Steven tries to heal her. He manages it partially, temporarily, enough to get glimpses of who she was. Her name was Nephrite. She was a pilot. She commanded a crew. And when she's given any degree of coherent memory, the one thing she keeps trying to communicate over and over is that she needs to find her crew. She needs to know that they're all right. That's what survived. Not strategic thought. Not complex reasoning. Just that one deeply felt concern. The love of a commander for the people she was responsible for. Her crew, as far as we can tell, were also corrupted. They became monsters separately, without her. She's been searching for them for thousands of years without knowing it. Because the search is the only thing left in her that remembers who she is. I don't know. It's a bit much. The crystal gems, for their part, have been dealing with the corrupted gems by bubbling them and keeping them in the basement of the Crystal Temple, a room called the Burning Room. There are a lot of bubbled gems in there. Some of them are gems that the crystal gems knew personally before the war. There's something about the Burning Room that I find quietly devastating. The crystal gems have been maintaining it for thousands of years. That means garnet and pearl, and eventually amethyst, have been adding to a collection of people they couldn't help, couldn't heal, couldn't communicate with, could only preserve. Every time they bubbled a corrupted gem, they were making a choice to keep that person in suspended existence rather than letting the gemstone shatter or lose coherence. It was the kindest available option. It was also an indefinite commitment with no visible endpoint. Rose tried to heal them. She couldn't. Her healing abilities, which were considerable, she could heal cracked gemstones with her tears, she could restore physical injuries, she could bring back the dead under certain conditions, weren't sufficient to address corruption. The damage was too deep. The only known cure required the cooperation of the diamonds. And the diamonds were not, for the entirety of Rose's life on Earth, available for cooperation. So the Burning Room grew slowly over thousands of years. The crystal gems carried their grief about it, each in their own way. Rose trying and failing to find solutions, Pearl managing the practicalities of it, Garnet holding the knowledge of what each of those bubbled gems had been, Amethyst growing up with a room full of people she never got to know. And none of them talked about it as much as they probably should have, because that's what happens when you carry something for long enough. It becomes the background of your life rather than a wound you're actively tending. Now, one more thing about corruption that's worth mentioning, because it's a detail the show drops quietly and doesn't return to very often. Homeworld didn't know what it was. Or more precisely, Homeworld knew what had happened on Earth. But younger gems like Peridot, who were made after the war, had no idea. Corruption wasn't common knowledge. It wasn't taught. The existence of thousands of corrupted gems living on Earth under the care of the crystal gems was apparently not a fact that Homeworld disseminated widely. You can read that a few different ways. Maybe the diamonds were ashamed of it. The corrupting light being an uncontrolled, grief-driven act isn't exactly something you'd want in the official records. Maybe they just decided it wasn't information that Era 2 gems needed. Maybe the whole thing was quietly filed away under events we don't discuss. Whatever the reason, Peridot arrives on Earth with her monitoring assignment and is genuinely shocked when she encounters corrupted gems. She doesn't know what she's looking at. She has no framework for it. The cure, when it finally came, required all 4 diamonds acting in concert. 3 of them could reduce the corruption temporarily, give someone like Nephrite a few minutes of partial clarity. But to fully reverse it took White Diamond as well. And that's a whole other story. The point is, it took thousands of years. And in the meantime, people sat in bubbles. There's one more element of the corruption story worth mentioning, because the show includes it in an episode that's easy to watch as background drama, and only later reveals itself as something more significant. When Garnet and Steven visit the kindergarten and find the forced fusion prototypes, which we'll cover shortly, Garnet is confronted with the fact that these beings are made from the shards of crystal gems she knew. Gems who were shattered in the war and then had their fragments collected and experimented on. She doesn't know this was happening. None of the crystal gems did. They knew about the corruption. They didn't know that Homeworld had taken the shattered remains of their fallen friends and used them as raw material for a weapons program. The grief in that discovery, in knowing that the loss you already mourned was followed by an indignity you weren't there to prevent, is something the show gives Garnet and then moves past fairly quickly, because there's plot to attend to. But if you slow down and sit in that moment, it's a lot. It's just a lot. Section 3, Echo, Section 3 Expanded. After the war ended, Yellow Diamond had a problem. Earth had been the site of Pink's alleged death. The rebellion had been crushed, the corrupted gems were scattered or bubbled, and the planet itself, which had been generating this whole mess for thousands of years, was no longer viable as a colony. The resources were partially depleted. The infrastructure had been damaged in the fighting. The whole thing had been a loss. In the cold accounting of what an empire considers a loss, Yellow Diamond's solution was not to walk away. Her solution was to bury a weapon inside the planet. The cluster is what the show calls it. The concept is this: the shattered remains of crystal gems from the rebellion, not corrupted gems, actually shattered gems, gems whose gemstones had been broken into fragments, were collected by Homeworld. Those fragments were then forced to fuse together, not into complete beings, into incomplete broken chimeras made of mismatched pieces, each fragment still retaining a fragment of consciousness, each fragment still, in some partial way, aware. These forced fusions are called cluster gems. They appear in the show as what look like body horror constructions, masses of mismatched limbs, disconnected arms and legs fused at the joints, multi-directional bodies that make no anatomical sense. They look like something's gone very wrong. What they're actually doing behaviorally is searching. When cluster gems detect another gem nearby, they move toward them aggressively. On the surface, this looks like an attack. What the show eventually makes clear is that they're trying to find their missing pieces. They're fragments of beings who used to be whole, who can feel that they're incomplete, who are reaching for the other parts of themselves. They're not attacking. They're desperate. The prototypes live in the kindergarten's control room, sealed in containers, dormant, until the containers are opened. 2 of them end up in a beach city hospital at one point, having been mistaken for victims of a traffic accident. The hospital staff treat them accordingly, which says something both tender and grim about the humans in this show. They see what looks like injured people and they try to help. The cluster itself, the main event, is a single, enormous forced fusion buried inside Earth's mantle, made of millions of gem shards. Not dozens. Millions. When Peridot explains it to the crystal gems, she says that if the cluster forms its physical body, it will be larger than the Earth itself. It will emerge through the surface and tear the planet apart from the inside out. And Homeworld could then use it as a geo-weapon against other worlds. The incubation period, when Steven and Peridot are racing to stop it, is nearly up. What Steven does with the cluster is one of my favorite things the show has ever done, because it's such an accurate distillation of who Steven is. Peridot's plan is to destroy it, drill down to the mantle, reach the cluster, attack it directly. Steven goes along with the drilling part, but when they actually reach the cluster, and Steven falls unconscious and makes contact with it through his dream state ability, he doesn't attack, he talks to it. He can hear them, the millions of fragments all trying to communicate, all reaching for something. And what he communicates back, essentially, is, you don't have to form. You can just be here together, you can be your own thing. He helps the cluster understand that it doesn't have to emerge and destroy everything. It can bubble itself, stay dormant, choose not to. And it does. The cluster chooses not to. There's a moment much later, in the final arc of Future, when Steven has become the pink monster I described earlier and is rampaging through Little Homeworld, where the cluster actually comes back. It forces part of itself to emerge from the earth, a giant arm reaching up through the crust, and it holds Steven still long enough for the people who love him to reach him. A being made of millions of suffering fragments, whose choice not to destroy Earth Steven had asked for years ago, comes back to help him in the moment he needs it most. The cluster, even in its state, remembered. It chose a side, and the side it chose was Steven's, because Steven was the first being who had ever asked it what it wanted. Years later, when Yellow Diamond is trying to make amends for what Homeworld did, one of the things she commits to is restoring the cluster gems, putting the individual shards back together, reconstructing the people they used to be. It will take a very long time. Very long. The show acknowledges this without making a big speech about it. Now, I want to mention something I skipped over in the corruption section and am coming back to here. Garnet's reaction when she and Steven find the forced fusion prototypes in the kindergarten's control room. Garnet is, and I say this with deep affection, extraordinarily composed in difficult situations. She's the one who holds things together. She's the one Steven and the others look to when something is wrong and they need to know if they should be afraid. She has what might charitably be called a high threshold for showing distress. When she finds the prototype cluster gems, she shakes. Ruby and Sapphire, the two gems who fuse to form Garnet, begin to involuntarily separate from each other because what she's experiencing is so fundamentally wrong that it destabilizes her at the level of her component parts. She's been holding the fusion of herself together through love and through choice every moment of her existence, and these forced fusions are the antithesis of everything she is and everything that fusion means to her. She says quietly that this is the most wrong thing she's ever seen. Coming from someone who has seen the corrupted gems, who lived through the war, who has thousands of years worth of context for what wrong looks like, that's not hyperbole. She means it precisely. There's a layer to her reaction that becomes clearer later. Garnet is herself a forbidden fusion, a fusion of two different gem types, which Homeworld considers deeply inappropriate, a violation of the natural order. She's been the living proof for thousands of years that forced or prescribed hierarchy around fusion is wrong. And here are gems being forcibly fused, their fragments bound together without choice or consent as prototypes for a weapon. It's the darkest possible inversion of everything she represents. I also want to mention the prototype's behavior one more time, because I think the detail is easy to move past too quickly. When cluster gems detect other gems, they reach for them. They extend whatever limbs they have and they move toward the other presence. The show codes this visually as aggression. It looks like an attack. It functions as a threat. But what's actually happening, as the show gradually makes clear, is that they're searching. They're fragments that can feel their own incompleteness, and they're reaching for the parts of themselves that they sense nearby. A gemstone functions, in the show's logic, somewhat like a very complex data storage system. The self, memory, personality, the accumulated experience of a being's existence is held in the gemstone. When a gemstone is shattered, the self fragments across all the pieces. Each shard holds something. And when those shards are forced into contact with each other, the fragments are reaching. Still, toward the whole they used to be. They're not reaching for the crystal gems in those kindergarten corridors. They're reaching for themselves, Peridot mentions, and it's later implied more strongly, that Yellow had the cluster project commissioned in part to erase Earth from Homeworld's records. Not just to build a weapon. To obliterate the planet that had taken Pink Diamond. To remove the site of that loss from existence. To make it as if Earth had never been a factor in anything. That's grief doing something extraordinarily destructive. That's a being with unlimited resources and no one to tell her no, using that power to try to make pain go away by eliminating its source. It doesn't work that way, of course. It never does. But the cluster exists, at least in part, because Yellow Diamond missed her sister and didn't have a healthy outlet for that. The forced fusion prototypes in the kindergarten are, according to many people who've watched this show, the single darkest element of it. The Cluster Gems wiki describes them as the most disturbing characters in the series, and I think that's probably right. Not because they're scary in a jump scare way, but because the logic of them, once you sit with it, is so thoroughly horrible. These are people who were shattered in a war, already a terrible thing, and then had the fragments of themselves stitched together with fragments of other people's selves, and then sealed in containers and left to be used as test subjects for something even larger. The fact that they're reaching out for their missing pieces makes it worse, not better. They're not empty. There's something in there that still knows it used to be whole and isn't anymore. I want to talk about Bismuth because I think her story gets summarized as the crystal gem who went too far. And that summary, while not exactly wrong, misses most of what makes her interesting and sad. Bismuth was the crystal gem's forge master. She made their weapons, their armor, the tools they used in the war. She was enormous and warm and intensely committed to the cause. One of those people who seem to generate momentum just by being in a room. Everyone loved Bismuth. Rose loved Bismuth. When Stephen finds her and wakes her up, thousands of years after the war, the first thing he sees is someone who is thoroughly, joyfully alive in a way that makes it very clear she was sorely missed. She was a former homeworld gem who joined the rebellion because she understood what the caste system cost people. Bismuth were workers in homeworld's hierarchy, the builders, the constructors, the physical laborers. Useful, valued for their function, not treated especially well. She saw the rebellion and she saw freedom, and she chose it without hesitation. During the war, she developed a weapon she called the Breaking Point. It was a tool designed specifically to shatter gems, to use against the Diamond's forces in a way that would be decisive. Rose's side was losing ground. They were being outmanned and outresourced. Bismuth's argument was practical, even if it was brutal. We are fighting people who will shatter us without a second thought. Why are we holding back? Rose's answer was that they didn't shatter, that it wasn't who they were. They argued. The argument became a fight. And Rose poofed Bismuth and bubbled her and put her inside Lion's Mane, the pink pocket dimension where Rose kept her most private things, and told the other crystal gems that Bismuth had been lost at the Battle of the Ziggurat. Not captured, not injured, lost. A word that implies an accident, something that couldn't be helped, nothing that required further explanation. The other crystal gems, Garnet and Pearl, accepted this. They grieved Bismuth and moved on. No one thought to ask more questions. Rose had spoken, and Rose's word was, at that point in the crystal gem's existence, essentially final. Bismuth spent thousands of years in a bubble, unconscious, as gems are when they're not projecting a physical body, but alone in a pink dimension while the people she loved fought and lost and eventually, after the war, went on with their long and complicated lives. When she wakes up to Stephen, not to Rose, who she's expecting, not to her friends, to this short, half-human kid who has to explain to her that several thousand years have passed and things have changed considerably. Her reaction to learning that Rose was Pink Diamond, that the person who bubbled her and kept her secret was, in fact, a diamond running a rebellion against her own empire, who had more power than she'd ever let on and far more complicated motivations than she had admitted to, is one of the show's more raw moments. She pushes her face into the lava that runs through the crystal temple and screams. And then she comes up and says that it all makes sense now. She looks at the burning room where the bubbled, corrupted gems are kept, and she looks at herself, also recently unbubbled, and she draws a line. Rose bubbled anyone who disagreed with her. Anyone who pushed back, anyone who confronted her, anyone who became inconvenient. Bismuth was bubbled for challenging Rose's ethics. The corrupted gems are bubbled because they couldn't be healed yet. But the mechanism is the same. The bubbling is a way of managing problems rather than facing them. She's not being entirely fair. The corrupted gems are bubbled for their own protection and the protection of others, and Rose couldn't have done more for them than she did. But she's not wrong about herself. She was bubbled because she was inconvenient. The question Bismuth's story raises about Rose Quartz is one the show doesn't fully answer. Did Rose bubble Bismuth to protect her principles? To prevent the crystal gems from becoming the kind of force that shattered their opponents? Which would have changed who they were fundamentally? Or did she do it partly because Bismuth had figured out something uncomfortable? That the war as Rose was running it couldn't be won. That the ethical constraints Rose insisted on were also strategic constraints. And that facing that honestly would have required admitting things Rose wasn't ready to admit. Probably some of both. People are usually some of both when they make the choices that hurt others. The question Bismuth's story raises about Rose Quartz is one the show doesn't fully answer. Did Rose bubble Bismuth to protect her principles? To prevent the crystal gems from becoming the kind of force that shattered their opponents? Which would have changed who they were fundamentally? Or did she do it partly because Bismuth had figured out something uncomfortable? That the war as Rose was running it couldn't be won. That the ethical constraints Rose insisted on were also strategic constraints. And that facing that honestly would have required admitting things Rose wasn't ready to admit. Probably some of both. People are usually some of both when they make the choices that hurt others. There's a broader pattern worth naming here because Bismuth fits into it. Rose, over the course of her long existence, acquired a habit of managing problems by making them invisible. Bismuth didn't agree with her, so Bismuth was hidden. The truth about Pink Diamond didn't suit what the crystal gems needed to believe about their mission, so the truth was buried. The corrupted gems couldn't be helped, so they were preserved in a room that visitors didn't go into. None of these were acts of malice. They were acts of someone who loved the people around her and found it easier to protect them from complicated truths than to face the complications together. What this means, in practice, is that the crystal gems Stephen grows up with are all carrying things they were never told they were carrying. Garnet doesn't know the full story of the war she fought in. Pearl has been holding a secret that's eating her alive for thousands of years. Amethyst is carrying the weight of having been born in a kindergarten that was there to destroy the planet she loves. None of them had the full picture, and Rose made sure of that. There's a parallel worth drawing here too, something else in the show that doesn't get talked about much. The crystal gems as a group don't talk about the war very often. They have thousands of years of shared history, and they very rarely discuss it with each other. When the subject comes up, it tends to be in fragments. A reference here, a memory triggered by a specific location or encounter there. The full shape of what happened is never laid out in a single sitting by anyone. That could be the reticence of people who have simply been through something that's hard to talk about, which is believable. It could also be a product of having a leader who modeled not talking about things, who set the tone of the group's relationship to its own past in a way that persisted long after she was gone. Either way, Stephen inherits a family that is collectively very good at not saying the thing, and he spends most of the show gently and persistently making them say the thing. Stephen, inheriting all of this, is the first person who actually puts the picture together, and the putting together is most of what the show is. What I keep coming back to is the time scale. Bismuth spent thousands of years in a bubble because Rose didn't want to deal with the argument. That's not how you describe it if you were being generous, but it's the shape of what happened. And when Bismuth woke up, every friend she had from that era was either corrupted, shattered, or so changed by millennia of experience that they were effectively different people. She came back to a world that had moved on without her, in the space of what was, for her, a moment. There's a small detail I love about this. When Bismuth is learning about corruption for the first time, she's never encountered it. She didn't know it was possible. She goes immediately to one of the bubbled, corrupted gems in the burning room. She unbubbles her. She tries to talk to her. The gem's name was Biggs Jasper, and she was Bismuth's friend. And Bismuth just stands there talking to her, expecting a conversation, while Biggs Jasper, who is completely corrupted, can't respond in any coherent way. It's quiet, and it's terrible. And Bismuth puts Biggs back in the bubble, and she cries. And that's that. Lapis Lazuli wasn't a crystal gem. That's the first thing, and it matters more than the show initially makes obvious. She was visiting Earth during the colonization period. Not as a soldier, not as a rebel, but most likely as a terraformer. Lapis Lazulis in Homeworld's hierarchy were used to reshape the physical environment of planets being prepared for colonization. Moving water, altering landscapes, the kind of large-scale geological work that their particular abilities suited them to. She was there doing something functionally administrative, something that in the normal course of events would have been unremarkable. And here's what I find quietly pointed about that. Lapis wasn't a fighter. She wasn't a combatant. She wasn't a rebel or a soldier or someone who had taken sides in the war. She was a terraformer doing her job on a planet that happened to be at war. The fact that she spent thousands of years imprisoned in a mirror as a consequence of that, of simply being in the wrong place, is one of the most precise illustrations of what it means for ordinary beings to be caught inside massive political conflicts they didn't choose and had no power over. That's actually a fairly common experience in history. The people who end up carrying the consequences of large events are often not the people who made the choices that caused those events. And the show, by giving us Lapis, gives us a face for that experience. Then, the war happened around her, and at some point during the chaos, Bismuth poofed her. Probably during a skirmish, probably without knowing exactly who she was or why she was there. And the homeworld soldiers who found her gemstone made an assumption. She must be a crystal gem. She's on Earth. She's clearly been in a fight. She must be a rebel. They trapped her gemstone in a mirror, a device that could record and display memories used to interrogate prisoners, and took her in for questioning. The questioning apparently didn't go especially well, or they simply gave up on getting useful information out of her, because the mirror was abandoned. During the final evacuation of Earth, when the corrupting light hit and everyone was scrambling to leave, someone put Lapis down and didn't pick her back up. The mirror was left at the Galaxy Warp, a broken hub for Homeworld's teleportation network, and it stayed there for thousands of years. She was conscious in there. The show makes this clear quietly. She could see what the mirror showed. She could hear things. She was present, in whatever sense a gem trapped in a reflective surface can be present, for the entire duration. The Galaxy Warp decayed. Beach City grew up nearby. Eventually the mirror ended up in the crystal gem's possession and was used eventually as a teaching tool, something to show Steven to illustrate how gem communications technology worked. And Lapis was in it the whole time, watching, unable to communicate in any way that the crystal gems, who, let's be clear, should have known better, took seriously. Steven noticed. He saw her moving in the mirror's reflections in ways that weren't purely responsive to his questions. He heard something that sounded like an attempt at communication. He listened. He let her out. Her first act upon being freed was to try to steal the ocean, all of it, the entire ocean, to create a pathway back to Homeworld across space. Her powers are genuinely extraordinary. She's one of the most powerful gems we encounter in the show, at least in terms of raw hydrokinesis. And she put all of that power into one goal: go home. Get to Homeworld. Even though Homeworld had never helped her, even though she'd been left behind, even though she didn't know what awaited her there or how she'd be received. It was the only direction she knew. After thousands of years of being unable to move toward anything, she was going to move toward the one fixed point she had. I want to pause on the mirror itself for a moment, because there's something about it I find quite strange and worth sitting with. The mirror wasn't deactivated or destroyed after Lapis was captured. It was used as a communications and recording tool. Homeworld gems accessed it for its original function, while Lapis was inside it, and presumably they could see the recordings it displayed, and presumably those records were useful. The mirror worked. The person inside it was just an inconvenience, or more likely, simply not considered. Then it was abandoned at the galaxy warp during the evacuation. And then, at some point, in the thousands of years afterward, it ended up in the crystal gem's possession. The show doesn't fully explain how, which is fine, these things happen. And it was used as a teaching tool. Pearl at one point uses it to display information about gem technology for Steven. The mirror is helpful for this. The person inside it trying to communicate is what gets noticed eventually. Steven notices. He's always been a bit better at paying attention to things that are trying to reach him than most people are. The thing I find most affecting about Lapis's story isn't actually the mirror imprisonment, as awful as that is. It's Malachite, Jasper, who arrives on Earth as part of a homeworld inspection mission and has, by that point, already done several things that are difficult to forgive, forces a fusion with Lapis. Jasper is physically powerful enough to make this coercion feel real. Malachite is the name of the resulting fusion, and she's enormous and unstable and deeply hostile, which is what you'd expect from a forced union between two beings with a significant power differential who have no desire to be in this situation. What Lapis does next is something she didn't have to do. She could have let the fusion collapse on its own. Forced fusions are unstable, and Jasper wouldn't be able to maintain it without Lapis's participation. Instead, Lapis takes control. She drags them both to the bottom of the ocean and holds the fusion together by force, trapping herself and Jasper in a situation where Lapis is the prison and the prisoner simultaneously. She does this to keep Jasper from hurting anyone else. That's it. That's the reason. Lapis has just been freed from thousands of years of imprisonment, and her response to the first real threat that crosses her path is to imprison herself again, voluntarily, because she decided it was worth it. She spends months at the bottom of the ocean fighting for control against a gem who is significantly stronger than her in a direct confrontation, keeping that fight going through sheer willpower. When they finally get separated, when Steven and the crystal gems defeat Malachite in a battle on a remote island, Lapis is clearly damaged by the experience. Not shattered, not corrupted, but worn down in a way that's different from physical injury. The show is fairly careful about depicting what extended forced proximity to something harmful does to a person over time. When they finally get separated, when Steven and the crystal gems defeat Malachite in a battle on a remote island, Lapis is clearly damaged by the experience. Not shattered, not corrupted, but worn down in a way that's different from physical injury. The show is fairly careful about depicting what extended forced proximity to something harmful does to a person over time. What Lapis does afterward is, I think, underappreciated in discussions of her arc. She doesn't immediately retreat to somewhere safe. She doesn't cut off contact with everyone who reminds her of what happened. She agrees, slowly and with considerable reluctance, to live at the barn with Peridot, a gem who was, not that long ago, actively working to use the cluster to destroy Earth. She builds something there. A weird, grumpy, genuine friendship. She makes camp with someone who is also trying to figure out who she is outside of the role she was made for. It's not a dramatic recovery. It's the kind of recovery that looks like two people sitting in a barn, watching terrible television together and slowly becoming less guarded about it, which is probably the most realistic kind. The thing I think about sometimes when I watch Lapis's later episodes. The ones where she's more settled, more herself, making meep morps and arguing with Peridot about whether Camp Pining Hearts is a good program, is that she chose all of that. After thousands of years of being given no choices whatsoever, she made choices, small ones mostly, but hers. There's one small detail about Lapis that I think about whenever I rewatch her early episodes. Her gemstone was cracked when the crystal gems found her mirror. Cracked during the evacuation, trampled in the chaos, according to the canon timeline. She was running on a damaged gemstone for thousands of years. Her powers, which are already extraordinary, were operating at reduced capacity that entire time. The hydrokinesis she managed to demonstrate despite that is genuinely impressive. She got her gem healed by Steven eventually. His saliva could heal cracked gems, which is one of the stranger abilities in a show that has a fair few strange abilities. She thanked him and left immediately, which is entirely consistent with who she is as a person. Lapis takes a long time to trust. Given what I've just described, that seems quite reasonable. Blue Diamond created the zoo for Pink Diamond as a gift. That is the context you need to hold on to as I describe what the zoo actually is, because the context changes the shape of it considerably. The zoo is a facility on a space station in Pink Diamond's solar system, a large, carefully controlled environment where humans are kept, safely, comfortably, by almost any measurable standard. There's food provided automatically. There's light, pleasant and consistent. There are no predators, no disease, no weather extremes. It's a very pleasant place to be, in the way that a very pleasant enclosure is a pleasant place to be. The humans in the zoo were kidnapped from Earth during the colonization period and brought there. The show doesn't number them exactly, but there are enough generations worth that the current inhabitants, the humans Steven and Greg encounter when they end up inside the facility, have no memory of Earth. They've never seen it. They don't know it exists in any meaningful way. They have their own language, their own rituals, their own social structures built entirely within the walls of a space station that most of them don't know is a space station. Blue built it because Pink was sad about the humans. Pink had become attached to organic life in a way the other diamonds found baffling. And Blue, who did love Pink in her way, wanted to help. Here, she said, effectively. I've collected some of the humans you're worried about. They'll be safe here. Now you don't need to worry. This is an act of genuine affection. Blue thought she was solving a problem. She thought she was doing something kind. The humans, for their part, didn't get much say in any of this. The ceremony, the zoo humans practice, the choosing, as the show calls it, is a mating ritual facilitated by the zoo's systems. Lights indicate pairings. The humans follow the lights, form couples, and this is presented within the zoo's culture as simply the way things are done, the order of things, the natural shape of life. They don't know it's being engineered. They don't know what choosing is in any context beyond the one they've always known. Greg Universe, Steven's father, ends up in the zoo after being kidnapped by Blue Diamond during a particularly bleak stretch of the show. Greg is an adult human who knows exactly what the normal shape of life looks like, and the zoo's version of it is entirely foreign to him. He doesn't understand the choosing. He doesn't respond to the lights in the expected way. The other humans find this alarming because it doesn't fit any model they have for how a person behaves. They're not hostile to Greg, exactly. They just don't know what to do with someone who operates outside the rules of the only world they've ever known. Which is, when you sit with it, a fairly precise description of what it's like to exist in a system so complete that the system is invisible. The zoo humans aren't unhappy. They don't know there's anything to be unhappy about. And that's the thing Blue considers a success. There's a particular poignancy in Greg's position specifically. He's not a fighter. He's not a crystal gem. He's a man who fell in love with a complicated, immortal alien, had a son with her, and has been quietly getting on with being a fairly good dad ever since. He didn't sign up for interstellar kidnapping, he didn't train for it, he ends up in the zoo, and he just does his best to make sense of it, which is quite a lot more dignified than most people would manage. And his response to the humans in the zoo, when he figures out what the choosing is and what their lives look like, isn't condescension, it's sadness. He can see that they're not miserable, that they're people who have built something meaningful within the constraints they were given. And he can also see that those constraints were imposed without their knowledge or consent, that the entire structure of their lives was designed by someone who thought she was doing them a kindness. He sits with that contradiction and doesn't try to resolve it for them, because what would that even look like? The show doesn't have Steven rescue the zoo humans. It just has him and Greg leave when they can, and the humans stay, and the zoo continues to exist. And the complexity of that situation remains unresolved, because some situations don't resolve neatly. The humans in the zoo probably still live there. As of future, there's no mention of them being freed or choosing to leave. They're just still there. That's another detail the show drops and doesn't pick back up, and the dropping of it is doing something. The Famethysts deserve a mention here. They're the amethysts who guard the zoo, fam as in family, because they were all made in the same kindergarten. Our amethyst's kindergarten. They're technically related to her in the way that matters. In gem terms, they came from the same batch, the same place, the same conditions. They just ended up with different assignments. Their supervisor is a gem called Holly Blue Agate, and Holly Blue is deeply unpleasant to them. Not in the way of someone who's been given authority and enjoys abusing it arbitrarily. In the way of someone who is herself in a subordinate position and takes out the frustration of that subordination on everyone below her. It's a familiar enough dynamic. Holly Blue is probably treated dismissively by Blue Diamond and her higher ranking staff, so she treats the Famethysts dismissively. So the Famethysts have learned to expect that as the baseline. The show doesn't offer this as an excuse. It's just the texture of how hierarchies function when they're working as intended. What's interesting about the Famethyst as a group is how they've adapted to their situation. They've built their own culture inside the zoo's walls. A culture of affection and ribbing and solidarity. A kind of family that emerged from the specific conditions of their assignment. They work for Homeworld. They enforce a system of captivity. They also clearly care about each other, deeply. And the show doesn't ask you to resolve that tension into a simple verdict. They're people who were assigned to a role they didn't choose, doing the job as well as they can, sustaining each other inside it. When our amethyst meets them, when she realizes these are her sisters in the way that matters among gems made from the same place, the show gives her this moment of recognition that's quite beautiful and quite sad simultaneously. She belongs to them. She also got to be something entirely different from what they became because of an accident of timing. She emerged late and alone and was found by crystal gems. They emerged on schedule and were assigned to a zoo. The difference in their lives is entirely the product of circumstance. There's a room in the zoo that the show mentions almost in passing and then moves on from a large chamber full of bubbled rose quartz gems. When Pink Diamond faked her death and everyone believed that a rose quartz had shattered her, Blue Diamond's response was to bubble every rose quartz gem rather than shatter them outright. Pink had made that particular gem type. They were hers. Blue didn't want to shatter something Pink had created. So she preserved them, in stasis, in a room on a space station, indefinitely. These gems were bubbled for something one of them was incorrectly believed to have done. They've been in there for thousands of years, and Blue thinks of this as mercy. The word mercy is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It is mercy, within a framework that has shattering as its primary alternative. It is also imprisonment. Both of those things are true, and the show does not ask you to pick one and discard the other. It asks you to hold the discomfort of a being capable of both extraordinary grief and extraordinary harm, who experiences these not as contradictions but as expressions of the same devotion. Maybe it is mercy, by her framework. Certainly it's better than being shattered. But there's a word for being kept in suspended animation in a room because of the actions of someone else who shares your name, and that word isn't mercy. That's Blue Diamond in a nutshell, really. And it's the zoo in a nutshell. And it's quite a lot of Steven Universe in a nutshell. The harm and the care existing in the same space, neither canceling the other out, both asking to be understood on their own terms. There's a version of the show where the diamonds are simply irredeemable tyrants, and the story ends with their defeat. Steven Universe chose a more complicated version, and the zoo is one of the places that complexity lives most fully. Blue built a cage and called it a gift and meant it sincerely. That's a harder thing to sit with than cruelty that knows it's cruelty. The show thinks you can sit with it. I think it's right. Now, talking a bit about Spinel, who might be the saddest character in the show, and that's a competitive field. Spinel was created for Pink Diamond. That's the beginning of the story, and it's also, in some sense, the whole story. Pink had lost her first pearl. White Diamond had taken her as punishment for Pink's defiance, which is a whole other section's worth of material that we'll get to. Pink was lonely and unhappy, and the other diamonds didn't especially know what to do with a diamond who was lonely and unhappy, because the correct response to that state in Homeworld's framework was essentially, stop being that way. So someone had the idea to create Spinel, a companion gem specifically designed to be Pink's best friend and to make Pink happy. The design brief was cheerfulness and devotion, which Spinel had in abundance. Her physical design, and this is a real thing that Rebecca Sugar has talked about, is based on rubber hose animation, the style of early cartoons, pre-1930s or so, where characters have boneless, stretchy limbs and a simplified, almost liquid quality of movement. Sugar described this as representing that Spinel was frozen in time and didn't get a chance to develop. The design choice is doing exactly the emotional work you'd expect it to do, in retrospect. There's something in that description that I find deeply considered. Rubber hose animation came before. Animation had developed the tools to depict genuine emotional complexity. The characters are cheerful because the medium hadn't yet worked out how to do anything else. They bounce back from everything. They're resilient to the point of indestructibility because the story requires them to be. Spinel, designed in that aesthetic, is a being who was quite literally made without the capacity to stop bouncing back, until she wasn't anymore, until Pink's absence finally exceeded what she could absorb. Spinel and Pink played in Pink's garden on Homeworld. They played games, they entertained each other, they were, within the terms the show establishes, genuinely fond of each other. Pink was happy in those moments in a way she wasn't in most of the rest of her existence. But Pink grew. Slowly over time, she was given more responsibilities, more context, more of the diamond life she'd been lobbying for. She got her colony, Earth, and she started coming back to the garden less frequently. And less frequently than that. And then, eventually, almost not at all. Spinel noticed. Spinel waited. Spinel kept playing the games they'd played, kept the garden, kept being ready for whenever Pink came back. There's something I want to note about the specific texture of what waiting that long actually looks like, because the show communicates it mostly through implication rather than showing it directly. When we first see Spinel in the present day, in the movie, not the main series, she's standing in the exact position she was left in. She hasn't moved. She hasn't sat down or wandered or done anything except stand in the spot Pink told her to stand in. Because the game said to stand there, and the game was her entire point of reference for what she was supposed to be doing. The show, to make this land, doesn't show us time passing around her. It just tells us the number and leaves you to fill it in yourself. The thing your brain does with that span of time is entirely your own work, and it's different for every person who encounters it, which is part of why it stays with you. I think about whether she ever got tired, whether the devotion the show suggests she maintained was constant and unbroken, or whether there were periods of doubt, of wondering, of almost moving, and the discipline or the programming or the love that held her in place anyway. The show doesn't answer this. Spinel doesn't say. What we get is the aftermath. The person who was left waiting, who finally found out it was never a game. The day Pink left for the last time, she told Spinel it was a new game. Stand in this spot. Don't move. Wait for me to come back. And Spinel, who had been built for devotion, who had no framework for Pink doing something unkind because nothing in her existence had prepared her for that possibility, agreed. That was the game. She'd play it. Pink became Rose Quartz, lived on Earth for thousands of years, fell in love with Greg Universe, gave up her physical form to bring Stephen into the world, and Spinel stood in the garden, 6,000 years, standing in one spot, waiting. The show doesn't show us those years directly. It doesn't have to. The gap between Pink left and Spinel learns the truth contains everything you need to know just in its duration. It's too large a span to hold in your head at once, really, but you can get at it obliquely. The Roman Empire rose and fell several times over in that span. Agriculture was invented, spread, transformed human civilization entirely. The concept of written language was developed from scratch. All of that happened while Spinel stood in a garden waiting for someone who had forgotten she existed. How Spinel found out is almost as bad as the waiting. She didn't have a conversation with anyone. She didn't get an explanation or an apology. Stephen, in the early part of the main show's timeline, sent a broadcast out to the entire universe, a message meant to introduce himself and announce that things were changing, that Pink Diamond was gone and Era 3 was beginning and everything would be okay now. Spinel was alone in the garden when that broadcast reached her. That's how she learned. A mass communication, not addressed to her specifically, telling her that the person she'd been waiting for had been dead for thousands of years and had apparently started an entire revolutionary movement and had a child with a human man, and all of it had concluded and none of it had included Spinel. The game, she understood finally, had never been a game. Her gemstone, which used to be a right side up heart, is upside down when we meet her. It inverted. The physical form of a gem reflects their psychological state, and her psychological state at that moment was a right side up heart turned completely over. She arrives on Earth furious, not just angry, genuinely unhinged in the specific way of someone who has been alone long enough that the borders of the self have become unclear. She doesn't know who she is outside of being Pink's companion. She was made to be an accessory for someone who forgot about her, and when that person ceased to exist, she had no identity left to fall back on because she'd never been given the chance to develop one. Her design changes when she shifts into her combat mode. The rubber hose bounciness becomes something sharper and more angular. The friendliness of her original form replaced by something that reads as genuinely threatening. The show is communicating visually that the Spinel who waited in the garden and the Spinel who's come to Earth are the same being. But something in the experience has pushed the cheerful surface aside to reveal what was always underneath it. Spinel is angry at Pink, not at Rose, at Pink. This distinction matters to her enormously, even if it's confusing from the outside, because they're the same person. But Spinel knew Pink. She didn't know Rose, and what Pink did to her was personal in a way that feels more specific, somehow, than whatever Rose did or didn't do in a war she wasn't part of. The detail that completes this for me is where she ends up. After everything, Spinel goes back to Homeworld with the diamonds. Three beings who also, in their various ways, have complicated and painful relationships with Pink Diamond's absence. She fits, oddly, among people who understand what it is to have been shaped entirely by their relationship with someone who's no longer there. What's interesting about her situation and future, in the episodes where she shows up at least, is that she seems to be building something. Not dramatically, not in any way that gets a lot of screen time, but there are hints that she's finding a way to exist that isn't entirely organized around either devotion or revenge. She's less clingy than she was with Pink. She can be in a room with the diamonds and also have her own thoughts about what's happening. She's embarrassed by her past behavior in the specific, healthy way of someone who has some distance from it now, and can see it more clearly than they could at the time. She doesn't know exactly who she is yet, outside of the person Pink made her to be. But she's figuring it out. That's more than she had before. She's still a little embarrassed about the whole thing, as a future. The self-awareness is real. She just doesn't quite know what to do with herself now that the story she was built around has ended. On Homeworld, pearls are made to order servants. Not in a vague general sense, in a specific design for the purpose sense. A pearl is created for a particular owner, shaped to that owner's aesthetic preferences and functional needs, and exists within gem society without the independent standing that other gem types have. The framework simply doesn't include the possibility of a Pearl with her own desires or her own agenda. That's not a failure of the framework to account for something that happens anyway. The framework is designed to prevent it from happening. And here's the thing about that framework that you only really notice once you've met several Pearls: it doesn't fully work. Our Pearl has opinions, she has preferences, she has aesthetic sensibilities and areas of passionate interest, and a whole inner life that the framework says she shouldn't have. Yellow Pearl and Blue Pearl, who we meet on Homeworld, also have recognizable personalities. The show's various Pearls aren't interchangeable. They're people, shaped by their circumstances the way all people are, but distinctly themselves within that shaping. The framework says they shouldn't be people. They are anyway. And the gap between the framework and the reality is where all the most interesting things in Pearl's arc live. Our Pearl, the one who lives with the crystal gems and has been raising Steven alongside Garnet and Amethyst, was made for Pink Diamond. She was given to Pink after White Diamond took Pink's original Pearl as a punishment. The replacement Pearl was, like all Pearls, shaped to suit her owner. In this case, with a fondness for the same colors, Pink favored the same aesthetics. A disposition suited to accompanying a Diamond who was, at heart, adventurous and emotionally complicated. Pearl loved Pink Diamond. I don't think that's in question. The love is evident across the show, even when it's refracted through decades of Pearl having redirected it toward Rose, toward protecting Rose's memory, toward raising Steven as Rose's legacy. It's the same love, really. It just had to adapt to the fact that Pink was gone, and Rose was a persona, and then eventually both of those things were the same person, and the whole story was considerably more tangled than anyone had realized. The thing that's harder to sit with than the love itself is the power structure the love existed within. Pink was Pearl's owner before she was Pearl's friend. That transition, from property to companion, happened over time, and it was genuine, and Pearl's growth through it was real. But you can't fully separate the affection from the foundation it grew on, and the foundation was a relationship where Pearl had no say in the matter. She was Pink's Pearl the way you might own a piece of furniture that improbably became your closest friend. The improbable friendship is real. The furniture's lack of initial agency is also real. Both of those things are true simultaneously. Pink's last act as a Diamond, the final command she gave Pearl when she staged her own death, was an instruction delivered from a position of absolute authority. She told Pearl never to speak of what had really happened to anyone. Not as a request. As a Diamond's command to her Pearl, in the specific way that a Diamond's command binds a Pearl at a level below conscious choice. Pearl couldn't tell the truth for thousands of years about any of it. She watched as the crystal gems carried the weight of questions they couldn't answer about Pink Diamond's death. She listened as Steven started piecing together fragments of the real story. She sent him a text message, "I want to tell you, but I can't." That has to rank among the more heartbreaking uses of an emoji in the history of the medium. She was trying to find the edges of the command, the margins where she could nudge him in the right direction without directly violating the order that had been baked into her at a fundamental level. The episode where Steven goes into Pearl's mind to retrieve her phone, a single pale rose, is structured as a slow, deliberate descent through layers of compartmentalized memory. Pearl has organized her mind around the secret. The phone is buried beneath everything else because the phone is connected to the truth, and the truth is kept as far from the surface as possible. When Steven finally reaches the memory he needs, he sees Pearl in the form of Rose Quartz, holding Pink Diamond's gemstone in her palm. And he goes further back, and he hears the conversation, Pink telling Pearl what she wants her to do. Pearl hesitating, Pearl eventually agreeing because it was requested by the person whose request she had spent her entire existence orienting around. And then Pink gives the final command, "Never speak of this," and she leaves. And Pearl is left with the secret she'll carry for thousands of years. What strikes me about Pearl's arc across the full run of the show is how much of it is about learning to be a person in a way that wasn't part of her original design. Learning to want things for herself. Learning to make choices based on her own values rather than someone else's authority. She has to be taught gently, and sometimes not so gently, that her opinion matters and that she's allowed to have preferences that don't defer to whoever happens to be nearby. It doesn't come easily or quickly. There are episodes scattered throughout the series where Pearl reverts to deferential, subordinate behavior under the right kind of pressure, and it's not presented as endearing. It's presented as the persistence of something that's difficult to fully move past. The show isn't cruel about it. It doesn't condemn Pearl for having been shaped by her circumstances, because of course she was. Everyone is. But it does insist that circumstances don't have to be destiny, and it gives Pearl room to discover that she can disagree and survive it, can have a self that isn't organized around serving someone else, can be her own kind of person. One of the quieter things the show does with Pearl across its run is give her interests that are clearly hers. She's interested in the technical side of things. She can repair gem technology. She understands the engineering of homeworld's equipment. She finds this satisfying in a way that isn't about being useful to anyone in particular. She's a good teacher when she's not being anxious about it. She has strong aesthetic opinions. She plays the violin, and it sounds beautiful. None of these things were assigned to her. They accumulated because she had time and freedom and a family that imperfectly gave her space to be someone. That's a slow process, Senish. The show is honest that it's slow, but it's real. By the time we're in future, and she's helping figure out how her phone works, she's genuinely someone different from the being who was created to orbit Pink Diamond. Which doesn't mean she's fully past it. The show has a late episode, in future, where Pearl gets her memory wiped by a reset device and reverts to her factory settings, which is an unambiguously home-world Pearl configuration, waiting for her owner, uncertain without them, performing servitude automatically. Watching her in that state is one of the more quietly distressing things the show does, because it shows you the distance Pearl has traveled by, showing you where she started. The recovery from that state, when it comes, involves a song and Steven's father, and a lot of emotional labor from people who love her. That's about right, I think. That's roughly how recovery from deeply ingrained patterns tends to work. By the end of Future, she's got a phone she figured out how to use herself. She's learning to cook. She's tentatively, carefully, building a life that has room for her own wants in it. That's not a small thing, given where she started. Since we're on the topic of things Rose kept in her private dimension without telling anyone, let's talk about Lion. Lion appears early in the show, in the desert near Beach City, and follows Steven home. He's large and pink and improbable, with a mane that contains a pocket dimension accessible by climbing through it. A vast pink savanna where Rose stored her most private belongings. Her sword. A videotaped message to Steven she recorded before she gave up her physical form. Bismuth's bubbled gem. Various other things she wanted, kept close but not visible. The show implies, and later confirms through parallel, that Lion was not always a magical pink lion. He was, at some point in the relatively distant past, a regular lion who died. Rose found him, or perhaps she'd known him, kept him as a companion in the desert, the way she apparently wandered with a pride of lions in the centuries after the war, just like the creature, and brought him back with her tears. The revival changed him. His fur turned pink, his mane became a pocket dimension accessible to those Rose trusted. He seems not to need food or water in any normal sense. He can teleport over large distances. He can generate force fields. He's been carrying Rose's secrets since before Steven was born, because Rose trusted him to hold them. There's something about Lion as a character, and he is a character even if he doesn't speak, that I find quite moving when you understand the full picture. He's been waiting, alone, for Steven to come along. Not because he was told to wait. Not because a diamond commanded it. Just because that's who he was shaped to be, by the person who brought him back. He's faithful in the way that things shaped by love tend to be faithful, long after the person who loved them is gone. He's been carrying her things in his mane and bringing Stephen to places he needs to go, and placing himself between Stephen and danger, quietly, consistently, without any acknowledgement required. He's probably been very lonely. The show doesn't really go into this, but Rose died thousands of years after Lion. In timeline terms and in the gap between Lion's death and Stephen's birth, Lion spent some number of years alone in a desert, with a pink pocket dimension full of the belongings of someone who was still alive on the other side of the world and not coming back. That's a detail the show earns by not making a big deal of it. Lion doesn't speak, which is its own kind of melancholy when you think about it for a moment. He knows everything. He was there. He watched Rose live her long, complicated life on Earth and kept all the things she asked him to keep. And he can't tell anyone about any of it. He's devoted in the specific way of something that was given a shape by someone who loved it. And that devotion outlasted the person. The Lars situation illuminates all of this in an unexpected way, because it happens on screen and we get to watch what the resurrection actually looks like. Lars Barriga, who was a fairly ordinary beach city teenager, occasionally difficult, occasionally brave, better than he usually gives himself credit for, ends up on Homeworld with Stephen in a particularly chaotic stretch of the 5th season. He dies there. Not metaphorically, not as a near miss. He's thrown into a rock column by the explosion of a shattering robonoid he was trying to destroy to protect a group of gems who just saved their lives, and he hits with enough force that his heart stops. Stephen, crying over Lars, gets tears on his face, and the tears are absorbed into Lars' skin. And Lars starts glowing pink. And he comes back. His skin is pink now, his hair is pink. He has a scar across one eye from where he hit the column. When someone later checks, his heartbeat is there, but it's extremely slow, much slower than a normal human's. He apparently no longer needs food or water. His hair has become a portal to the same pocket dimension that Lion's mane accesses, connected by a tree that marks the link between the two entrances. Stephen can walk through Lion's mane on Earth, cross the pink savanna, and emerge through Lars's hair on Homeworld. Or wherever Lars happens to be, which changes considerably as the show continues. Lars stays on Homeworld. He makes the choice deliberately. Stephen can use him as a doorway to get home, but Lars and the Off-Colors, a group of Homeworld gems who hide because they are considered defective, need another way out, and they're not going to leave Lars stranded on his own. Lars takes charge of the group. He steals a ship. He becomes, over the arc of what we see of them, a fairly competent space pirate and a quite good person. He eventually makes it back to Earth. He opens a bakery. But what I keep thinking about is what it means to live as something that was dead. Lars's heartbeat is barely there. He might not age at the same rate as other humans now. The show doesn't specify, but the parallel to Lion, who was presumably a normal lion and is now ageless and magical, suggests it. His best friends in Beach City are growing up and moving on, and Lars might simply not, in the same way. He has no category for what he's become. Neither does anyone else. Rose kept so many things hidden. Bismuth, the breaking point, the truth of Pink Diamond. Her own to nature as someone with the power to reshape life through grief. Lion was holding her secrets in his mane. Lars, unasked, has inherited a piece of that. He has a doorway to Rose's private world in his hair, and he didn't ask for it and can't really get rid of it. And it's his now. What this makes me think about is the question of what else might be in that pocket dimension. The show gives us a few things: the sword, the videotape message to Stephen, the items that were clearly curated and placed deliberately. But a pocket dimension is large. Rose lived for thousands of years. Whatever she kept in there, whatever she considered private enough for the most private space she had, we've only ever seen a portion of. The videotape message is worth mentioning separately. Rose recorded it before she gave up her physical form to bring Stephen into the world. She knew she wouldn't be there to raise him, so she left him a message. And the message is, and I mean this in the most affectionate possible way, quite bad at being reassuring. She talks about Stephen as being an experience of living. She says she's giving up her physical form to create him, which is true. But the way she says it is abstract and philosophical rather than warm. She sounds like someone who loves the idea of what Stephen will be and doesn't quite know how to communicate to the specific baby who will watch this tape. It's not a bad message. It's just the message of someone who was very good at loving in ways that cost her something and less practiced at the kind of love that just says, I'm here, you're enough, you don't have to be anything in particular. Stephen watches that tape eventually. He cries. And then he keeps going. There's something in this that feels like how grief and legacy actually work. You inherit things from people who didn't consult you about it, and you carry them. And you build a life that has room for the weight even though you didn't choose the weight. Lars's Bakery is, in its way, a very good answer to that situation. White Diamond barely appears in the main series. She's mentioned, referenced, clearly significant, and then largely absent until the show is ready to bring her in directly. Which is itself a kind of storytelling choice? The thing you're not allowed to look at directly tends to shape everything around it. She's the first diamond, or at least the oldest one we know of. The others, yellow, blue, pink, came after her, and the hierarchy of the diamond authority reflects this. White sits at the top, her authority unquestioned to a degree that the other diamonds, who have enormous authority themselves, don't quite match. She's perfect in her own telling. She is the standard against which everything else is measured, and everything else falls short. Homeworld's architecture reflects this literally. The gem homeworld is built in the shape of a diamond, and White Diamond's palace is at its center, at the top of everything, visible from essentially everywhere on the surface. It's not subtle. It's not meant to be. The first sign of something genuinely wrong with White Diamond is her pearl. The crystal gems have met several pearls at this point, Yellow's pearl, Blue's pearl, both of whom have personality and effect and exist as individuals within the constraints of their role. White Pearl, when Stephen encounters her, is different. Her voice modulates oddly. Her expressions don't quite track with what she's saying. When she speaks, sometimes what she's communicating seems to be coming from somewhere else, directed through her rather than originating in her. This is because White Diamond has been using her pearl as a remote puppet, speaking through her body, controlling her movements, treating her less as a being with even the minimal independence that pearls have and more as a mouthpiece with legs. How long this has been going on is not specified. Given the general timescales of gem history, probably quite a while. White's ability, her specific diamond power, is the extraction of a gem's gemstone from their physical body. Other diamonds have their abilities. Yellow can destabilize gem bodies with electricity. Blue can overwhelm emotions. White can reach into a gem and pull out the core of them. And when she has the gemstone in her possession, she can control it. The gem whose stone she holds becomes an extension of her will. Their eyes going white. Their personality suppressed or overwritten by hers. The show is careful not to dwell too long on what the implications of this are for Homeworld's history, but it doesn't have to. You can think your way there. If White Diamond, the supreme authority in gem society, has had this ability for as long as she's existed, and there's no reason to think otherwise, then the question of how often she's used it, and on whom, and for what reasons, is one that the show leaves open in a way that's almost more unsettling than an explicit answer would be. What we know she did, she used it on her pearl for an apparently extended period, to the point where White Pearl lost whatever autonomy she'd had and became essentially a mouthpiece. She used it on Stephen during the Homeworld confrontation, not understanding that his half-human biology would make the extraction dangerous in a way that wasn't true for a pure gem. She likely used it on Pink Diamond at some point, or at least threatened to. The threat might have been part of why Pink felt so trapped that staging her own death seemed like the only option. When she does this to Stephen, or pulls his gem from his body during the confrontation on Homeworld, two things happen. His human half, suddenly without the gem, nearly dies. His gem half, separated from the human, becomes something purely gem, the pink Stephen, a version of him that is all of his diamond power and none of his learned humanity. Enormous, implacable, barely coherent. White tries to control it and can't. She expected Pink Diamond to come back. She got something she didn't have a category for. White's worldview, as she eventually explains it, is this. She is perfection. And because she is perfection, any flaw that exists in the other diamonds is a flaw that she somehow contains. She has to manage everything because everything is an extension of her. Pink was the most extreme version of this. The furthest from White's standards, the most difficult to manage, the one who kept insisting on being herself instead of being what White needed her to be. Rebecca Sugar, in various discussions of the show, has talked about White Diamond as having emerged as a kind of overarching consciousness, possibly the first gem in some meaningful sense, with the others coming from her or after her. Pink, in this reading, is the part of White that was most clearly repressed. The feelings, the impulsiveness, the empathy, the want for connection, expelled into a separate being and then managed at a distance. White's control of Pink isn't just political. It's almost like she's trying to contain her own disavowed self. There's something in this reading that makes White slightly more pitiable than she first appears. She built a civilization that mirrored her own psychology back at itself. A society where everything has its place, where deviation is corrected or removed, where the hierarchy exists to maintain a kind of order that is, ultimately, a projection of her internal compulsions. The caste system isn't just a social structure, it's an externalized version of the control White needs to feel over her own disavowed complexity, which doesn't excuse the harm, but it makes it comprehensible in a way that goes beyond powerful person does bad things because power. White did bad things because she was, in some fundamental way, frightened. Frightened of mess, of disorder, of the parts of herself she'd decided were unacceptable. And she had the resources to build an entire universe in the image of that fear. The cracks in Homeworld's architecture are worth mentioning. There are structural fissures visible in various parts of the planet's surface in the show, and no one explains them directly. One reading, popular in the fan community and fairly consistent with what we know, is that they're the result of a young Pink Diamond's tantrums. Pink, emotional and powerful and denied everything she asked for, might have physically damaged her environment in fits of distress, which would mean that Homeworld literally bears the marks of Pink being suppressed. The planet itself shows the cost of that arrangement. White's apology, when it comes, is real. The moment in Change Your Mind where she admits to having caused harm to Pink, to Yellow, to Blue, to Steven, to everyone is moving and the show earns it. She's been wrong in ways that were enormous and lasting, and she knows it. But the question I keep coming back to is, what was Homeworld like for thousands and thousands of years, with White Diamond at the center of it, able to reach into any gem and overwrite them if she chose to? The show doesn't answer this directly. It probably couldn't, within its scope, but it leaves the shape of the question visible. As a future, White is trying to figure out how to exist without absolute authority. It's not going especially smoothly. She's not cruel about it. She seems genuinely committed to doing better. She just doesn't quite know what better looks like yet, because she's spent longer than most civilizations have existed being the definition of correct. Learning is hard when you've never had to before. Steven Universe Future is the epilogue series. 20 episodes released in 2019 and 2020, set after the events of the main show and the movie. The premise is that everything worked out. The cluster is contained, the corrupted gems are healed, the diamonds have stepped back. Little Homeworld is being built next to Beach City, a place where gems can come to Earth and learn how to live without the hierarchy they were made for. The title of Future's theme song is Happily Ever After. The first episode of Future is called Little Homeschool, and it's quite cheerful. Steven is doing well. The opening credits show him surrounded by the people he loves, all of them apparently thriving. Here we are in the future, and it's bright, the theme says. And then, across about 20 episodes, you watch Steven Universe fall apart. Not dramatically, not all at once. The show is patient about it, which I think is what makes it so effective and, honestly, quite difficult to rewatch once you know where it's going. It's patient in the way that real deterioration tends to be patient, gradual, with enough good moments interspersed that you can convince yourself things are basically fine right up until they clearly aren't. The structural problem is simple. Stephen built his identity entirely around being needed, around being the one who fixes things, heals things, advocates for things, connects people to each other and to better versions of themselves. He is extraordinarily good at all of this. He's been doing it since he was a small child, but there are no more cluster gems threatening to destroy the earth. There are no more corrupted gems to heal. The diamonds are cooperative. The war is over. The problems he was born to address, that he inherited from his mother, that he took on before he fully understood what he was taking on, are resolved. Stephen doesn't have a purpose anymore, and he's never developed an identity that doesn't depend on being useful to others. This is presented gently in the early episodes of Future, and becomes less gentle as the series progresses. Stephen tries to help gems at Little Homeschool who haven't asked for help. He involves himself in conflicts that have nothing to do with him, because sitting with unoccupied time feels intolerable. He starts responding to situations with a level of intensity that's just slightly off. Too eager, too present, too committed to outcomes that aren't really his to control. The people around him notice, in the vague, uncomfortable way that people tend to notice when someone they love isn't quite right, and they don't quite know how to name it. There's an episode called Volleyball, which is about the two pink diamonds pearls learning to coexist and heal together, that contains a moment where Stephen genuinely cannot stop himself from trying to intervene in something that is not his situation to fix. He's asked, relatively kindly, to let the two of them work through it without him. He agrees. He then almost immediately starts trying to fix it again because the alternative, standing to one side, letting people he loves deal with their own pain without his help, is more distress than he knows how to tolerate. That's a fairly precise picture of what anxious helpfulness looks like when it's gotten past the point of being actually helpful. Meanwhile, his friends are growing up in the normal human way. Sadie has a band and is performing and building toward a life she's excited about. Lars is in space, which is the most Lars possible outcome, and is apparently thriving. Connie is applying to colleges. His beach city friends are looking toward futures that are genuinely theirs. Futures that don't revolve around the crystal gems and their adventures, because they're human, and they get to do that. Stephen can't quite do that. He doesn't know what his future looks like. He might not age at the same rate as his human friends. The show raises this, quietly, without resolving it. He might outlive people he loves deeply, the way that gems outlive almost everything. He doesn't say any of this out loud. His powers start behaving strangely. When he's under stress, he glows pink. He becomes stronger than he should be. He loses control in small ways that escalate over the course of the series into larger ways. Dr. Maheswaran, Connie's mother, who is a doctor and treats Stephen as a patient, gives him a PTSD diagnosis. The show says the acronym on screen, directly, in the context of a thoughtful and accurate depiction of what untreated trauma looks like when it finally surfaces. There's an episode in the middle of Future called Bismuth Casual, which is ostensibly about Stephen taking Bismuth to a roller rink where he's trying to teach Connie's old school friends to skate, and he keeps accidentally pink glowing and knocking people over. He laughs it off. Each time, he apologizes. He keeps going. The episode is gentle and there are funny moments, and it ends on a note that feels okay, mostly. But if you're watching closely, what you're watching is someone who has developed an involuntary stress response that manifests as a superpower, and he's treating it as mildly embarrassing rather than as something that needs attention. That pattern, noticing, minimizing, moving on, repeats across Future in increasingly serious iterations until it can't be minimized anymore. The list of things Stephen has experienced that qualified as traumatic is long, and no one, including Stephen, has really sat down and acknowledged it properly. Being used as bait multiple times, being put on trial for a war crime he didn't commit, having his gem extracted from his body, watching people he loved suffer in ways he couldn't fix, carrying the guilt of his mother's choices for his entire life, dying on homeworld and being brought back, the ongoing weight of being the only person in the universe who is exactly what he is. He starts making bad choices. Not villain arc bad choices. Just the specific bad choices of someone whose coping mechanisms have eroded past the point of function. He picks unnecessary fights. He looks for problems to solve when there aren't any. He takes on things that aren't his responsibility because taking things on is the only self-management strategy he has. And then he shatters Jasper. Jasper, who in the main series is one of the show's more formidable antagonists, who refuses to engage with Era 3 and keeps showing up at Little Homeworld wanting to fight because fighting is the only identity she has left, comes to Steven for training. Steven's instinct is to help her, but the fight they have escalates, and Steven, in a moment of rage and overwhelming power, shatters her, breaks her gemstone into pieces. She can be healed. This isn't permanent, but Steven did it. Steven, whose whole moral framework has been built around not causing that kind of harm. And what happens immediately after is arguably worse than the shattering itself. Jasper, when she's reformed, bows to Steven, calls him her diamond, because in her logic, he's proven himself more powerful than her, and in Homeworld's logic, that means she belongs to him now. The show doesn't let Steven feel good about this. It doesn't dress it up as a victory or a necessary act. It shows him looking at Jasper kneeling, seeing the shape of what he's just produced, understanding that he has replicated, with different mechanics but the same essential dynamic, exactly the kind of power relationship that he's spent his whole life trying to dismantle. He's reproduced his mother's worst patterns without meaning to, and with a degree of physical force that his mother never quite reached. This is, I think, the moment Future declares itself most clearly. It's not a show about a hero who saved the day and is now having normal epilogue adventures. It's a show about what it costs to be that hero, about the way that patterns you didn't choose have a way of reasserting themselves, about the distance between who you want to be and what you do when you're not managing yourself carefully. He then goes to White Diamond and tries to shatter her. He fails. He comes home. He spends an episode insisting to everyone, including himself, that everything is fine. Everything's fine is the title of that episode. The show is not being subtle. What happens at the end of it, when the not fineness becomes impossible to maintain any longer, is that Steven transforms. His distress, his self-concept, the conviction that he has become something monstrous, that he is the thing everyone else needs to be protected from, manifests physically. He becomes a giant pink monster and demolishes the house and stomps toward the ocean, and everyone who loves him has to figure out how to bring him back. There's a detail here that I find genuinely difficult to sit with. Pink Diamond probably went through something like this. The emotional instability that Yellow and Blue dismissed as immaturity, the outbursts that may have cracked Homeworld's architecture, the grief and the rage and the feeling of having no one who could really help. Pink was probably having her own version of what Steven experiences in Future, except alone, except without a Dr. Maheswarant, except without a Connie and a Greg and a Garnet, except without the show's writers treating her experience as something worth depicting with honesty and care. She just had the tower she was locked in when she made too much noise. Steven gets a hug. Connie rallies everyone. The crystal gems, the diamonds, his father, Lapis, Spinel, even the cluster rising from the earth, and they all just hold him. They tell him, one by one, what he did for them, the ways he helped them, not to fix him, not to perform at him, just to reach him. He cries. The tears turn the water around him pink. He comes back. The group hug scene, which is genuinely one of the best things the show ever does, works because it's not asking Steven to be healed. It's not giving him the cure. It's just the people who love him being present, each of them saying, in their own words, something they received from him. Garnet mentions falling apart and how Steven helped her back together. Peridot mentions Steven never giving up on her when everyone else would have. His father talks about the time they spent together in a way that's simple and real. And Connie, who rallies the whole thing, just says that he deserves the same thing he gives everyone else. That's the cure the show offers. Not power, not a resolution of circumstances, not a reason for the pain to have been worth it. Just, you're loved, we're here, you don't have to be okay right now. And then he goes to therapy. And he leaves Beach City for a while because he needs to. He drives away in the van his dad used to live in. And it's the right ending. Not a resolution, not a triumphant conclusion, just a beginning of something more honest than anything he's managed to sustain before now. The show ends with him on the road. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. The colonization system and what it actually meant for the planets on Homeworld's list. Pink Diamond, the youngest, the most ignored, the one who made a desperate choice that cost more than she intended. Corruption, and the people who became monsters without deserving to. The cluster, and the fragments of beings trying to find each other in the dark. Bismuth bubbled for disagreeing. Lapis, trapped in a mirror for thousands of years and then choosing captivity again to protect others. The zoo, and the humans inside it who don't know they're in a cage. Spinel, standing in a garden while entire civilizations rose and fell. Pearl, learning to be a person. Lars, living as something that was dead. White Diamond, at the center of everything, getting things catastrophically wrong for longer than most things have existed. And Steven, saving the universe and then quietly falling apart, and then slowly beginning again. The thing that makes all of this worth sitting with, and I think this is what the show understood about its own darkness, what makes it different from darkness for its own sake, is that nothing in it is presented as irredeemable. Not the corrupted gems, who were once people, and will be people again. Not the cluster, who chose not to destroy Earth and help hold Steven still when he needed it most. Not the diamonds, who were monstrous for thousands of years and are now, imperfectly and sometimes painfully, trying to be something else. Not even Pink Diamond, who made enormous mistakes and caused harm she couldn't undo, and also genuinely loved the world she fought to protect, and whose complexity the show refuses to reduce into either a simple villain or a simple hero. Every monster in this show was once someone. That's the line the show keeps drawing quietly, in the background of episodes that are ostensibly about Steven learning to float or Greg winning $1 million or the crystal gems going to a baseball game. Every creature they fight was caught in something larger than itself. Every antagonist has a story that, if you knew it fully, would make a certain kind of sense. That's not a comfortable idea. It's much easier to have clean categories, but it's a more honest one, and Steven Universe earns the discomfort by taking it seriously rather than using it as a shortcut to moral ambiguity. I also want to say something about the show's relationship with healing, because I think it's the through line that connects all the things we've talked about tonight. The corrupted gems couldn't be healed by Rose, could only be partially helped by Yellow and Blue. Needed all 4 diamonds together for the full restoration. And even then, it required Steven, the one being who was both gem and human and therefore outside every existing framework, to make the final connection. Healing in this show is never quick and never unilateral and never something one person can do for another. It requires the right conditions and the right relationships and, usually, more time than anyone would prefer. That's the most honest thing the show says, I think. It says it through the corrupted gems taking thousands of years to be cured. It says it through Bismuth needing the truth before she could move past the anger. It says it through Lapis making peace with the past at a pace that makes sense for someone who experienced what she experienced. And it says it through Steven, who saved the universe and still needed to get in a van and drive somewhere quiet and see a therapist. Because the universe being saved didn't automatically save him. Healing takes as long as it takes. The show trusts that you can sit with that. There's something else the show does that I appreciate, which is that it doesn't require resolution to proceed. Many of the situations we've talked about tonight aren't neatly wrapped up. The zoo humans are probably still in the zoo. The relationship between the crystal gems and the complicated legacy of Rose Quartz is ongoing. Spinel is building something new on Homeworld with 3 diamonds, who also have unresolved feelings about pink, and none of them are sure yet what they're building. Bismuth is still sorting out what she thinks about everything she's learned. These aren't failures of the writing. They're the show acknowledging that some things don't get resolved on a satisfying schedule, and that life, even animated alien life, continues in their presence. What you can do in the meantime is keep going. Build a bakery. Learn how your phone works. Get in a van. If you've made it this far tonight, thank you for spending some of the quiet hours with me and with these characters. If you fell asleep somewhere around the cluster or drifted off during Spinel, that's genuinely fine. This sort of lore is better absorbed slowly anyway, in pieces, over time, like the show itself. There's more I didn't get to tonight. The off-colors and what it means to be born wrong by Homeworld's standards. The kindergarten system and Amethyst's complicated relationship with the place she came from. Greg and Rose and the strangeness of what they had together. The Connie of it all, which is its own quiet thing. Garnet's origin story, Ruby and Sapphire, and what they chose, which is one of the most beautiful things in the show and probably deserves its own video. Maybe another time. For now, the show is still there whenever you want it. 5 seasons and a movie and an epilogue series worth of pastel colors and magic swords and characters who care about each other deeply and imperfectly. And underneath all of it, that persistent, patient darkness that makes the warmth mean something, gets